Hi everybody, today's lecture is on imperialism. This is lecture number 2, Imperialism for Unit 7. Alright, we've just covered the Industrial Revolution. We know that by the mid to late 1800s, most of Europe was undergoing massive industrialization. Any country that has gone through such a period of modernization will naturally try to expand. Why, you ask? Well, simply put, there are two primary reasons why a country might consider taking over some other nation. Number one, once a country uses their own resources, they might need to get some more somewhere else. So yeah, if you use up all the forests in your own nation, you might need to look elsewhere for a timber supply to build houses. Perhaps a more current example? Hey, if your country uses up all their own oil reserves and you need oil, you have to find a way to get that oil somewhere else. Today, the United States is oil dependent on OPEC nations. All right, OPEC nations. OPEC stands for Organization of Oil Exporting Countries. It's sort of like a club for countries that have massive oil reserves as their primary exports. Countries that belong to OPEC include many Middle Eastern and North African nations, as well as Venezuela, amongst others. So, following industrialization, many European nations looked elsewhere for the resources they needed. Two, the second reason countries look to gain territory in other parts of the world, well, and this is even more important than the first reason, European nations wanted to establish a marketplace to sell their goods. Basically, because of industrialization, there were many factories built in places like Great Britain. These factories were churning out so many products. Let's say, for example, that you're an owner of a sock factory. Your factory churns out millions of pairs of socks each year. Well, after a while, you might not make as much of a profit in your own country because, once people have bought enough socks, they don't need any more for a while, right? I mean, how many pairs of socks do you really need at one time?
And the clock goes tick, tick, tock. But there's one sound that no one knows. What does the sock say? No, 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 no.
So if you want to continue to make money off your socks, you need to start selling your socks somewhere else, preferably to a country that has a huge population. And you need to convince the people that live there that they need your socks, so you have to market socks to them. So simply put, Europeans needed to establish marketplaces around the globe following industrialization so that they could continue to make a profit. Let's put this in today's terms, because none of you care about socks unless you're Casey making the socket. Once everyone in the USA has an iPad, how will Apple make money? They need to start selling those in other places as well. But then what? Well, once a company has exhausted the possibility of a certain product, they'd better come up with a new trend that people feel they must have. And the business and innovation cycle continues. All right, and remember the expansion by England into Ireland that I kind of seemed to be going off on a tangent in last lecture? The whole Irish potato famine and quest for home rule that I talked about during my last lecture? Yeah, well, you know what? That's imperialism, people. So in order to get the resources they need, and in order to gain marketplaces around the globe, countries in Europe are going to begin taking over other nations. This wasn't anything new in the late 1800s. Europeans had long been colonizing other places following exploration. So what is imperialism? Well, the official definition is the domination by one country of the political, economic, and cultural life of another nation. Whew, wow, that sounds complicated. What does that mean? Basically it's when a bigger or stronger country takes over a smaller, weaker country to use its land and resources. Why? Well, powerful industrialized nations want political influence and economic might by building empires. There was an increased need for raw materials once resources were depleted after the Industrial Revolution in Europe. And just as a review from last year, there are really stages of imperialism that Europeans went through. There is old imperialism and then new imperialism. Old imperialism refers to the takeover and colonization by European countries between the years of 1500 to 1800. So it's the type of imperialism that happened before the Industrial Revolution. Colonies were established in the Americas, or the New World as Europeans refer to it, in South Asia, or India, as well as Southeast Asia. Territories were gained to a lesser extent in Africa and Asia. European powers were exploring during the Age of Old Imperialism. Why? Well, they were interested in God, gold, and glory. Explorers sought to spread Christianity, mostly in the form of Catholicism, and they were looking for riches like gold and silver and glory. They wanted to make their kings and nations as powerful as possible by adding to their territories. Perhaps the most well-known countries involved in old imperialism were Spain and Portugal during the 15 to 1600s, and then later the French and English and Dutch during the 17 to 1800s. New imperialism was the type of imperialism that happened between 1800 and 1914, or when World War I broke out. As countries developed new technologies like the steam engine during the Industrial Revolution, exploration became easier. Europeans were finally able to penetrate into the African continent. With new weaponry developed as a result of the Industrial Revolution, countries began competing to see who could gain the most territory around the globe. Great Britain definitely dominated the age of new imperialism, gaining massive amounts of territory in both Asia and Africa. In fact, it was said that, quote, the sun never sets on the British Empire, end quote. India, we learned last year, was Britain's jewel in the crown, or their most valuable territory. You already learned last year that it wasn't until 1947 that India gained its independence, with the help of Gandhi's civil disobedience. Remember? You also learned last year that as Europeans discovered valuable resources and potential markets in Africa, they had to find a way to divvy up the territory. They did this at the Berlin Conference in 1884. Leaders met to divide up Africa using national geographic barriers and former European claims. Unfortunately, the Europeans didn't invite any African leaders to this conference, and very often tribal boundaries were ignored, causing tribes to be separated or thrown together until the artificial boundaries that the Europeans created were later destroyed. This is going to lead to many years of ethnic strife or ethnic conflict once these nations begin gaining their independence following World War II or 1945. So you need to understand that there are two separate types of imperialism, old imperialism and new imperialism. You need to understand the difference between these periods of time. The type of imperialism we're going to focus on now is new imperialism. You should be on page 7 of your packet. Look at the political cartoon at the bottom of the page. Okay. And after you look at the cartoon, answer this question. And you only need to put down definitions. You only need a few definitions. The first, ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is the belief that your ethnic background or culture is superior to that of other people. You also need to understand that Europeans often justified their imperialistic policies because of something called social Darwinism. Remember last unit when I discussed this? Social Darwinism reflects a belief that successful and advanced people are more fit to rule the world. It was a social theory that came out of the Industrial Revolution and was often used as a justification for taking over other countries. My phone is ringing. How awkward. Okay, let me continue. The final definition you need, it's for the term white man's burden. The white man's burden was the belief held by many Caucasians or white Europeans during the late 1800s to 1900s that white people had an obligation to better their lives or better the lives of the less fortunate races in other parts of the world. Many Europeans believed that it was their moral duty or obligation to provide services and a better life for those they felt were inferior to the lives of Europeans. Okay, so hopefully you've written down those definitions somewhere on page 7, because I will be looking for them. Now, I would like you to pause the lecture and look at the cartoon on page 7. What type of European attitudes towards native populations does this cartoon convey? Explain. Okay, so now you've probably explained that cartoon, and now go to page 8 and read The White Man's Burden poem, written by Rudyard Kipling. Yep, he wrote the Jungle Book. Okay, so now what I want you to do is read the poem and then try to answer the 2 questions that follow on page 8, and then pause the lecture. Okay, finally, go to page 9. I want you to read Cecil Rhodes' Confession of Faith. After you have read this, use the bottom of the page to take some notes while you're reading, and I want you to think about the following. Who was Cecil Rhodes? I want you to Google him. Google this guy. Take some notes on him at the bottom of the page. I will definitely ask you about him. How does he feel about Anglo-Saxons, for instance? Okay, after you have completed page 9, you are now ready to review your notes in preparation for your quiz. Thanks for listening.